how are we halfway through the year already? I feel like I've been waiting for this year for ages because it was obviously the year we had booked our wedding. So, you know, I've been planning for the first half of 2025 for a while now, yet it's been and gone. We are now in the second half. What has happened? Anyway, I'm sure you've done plenty of musing on the passage of time with people in your own life already, so I won't dwell on it too much. Instead, I want to talk about some of the best books I have read in the first half of the year, but specifically the best books I read in April, May and June, because if you recall, I actually filmed a video after the first quarter, the first 3 months of 2025, January, February, March, where I talked about my favourite books from those 3 months, and rather than rehash some of the details of those books, I want to focus in on the books that I really enjoyed and stood out to me over the 3 months since then, and then hopefully I will remember to do a third quarter favourites and a final quarter favourites, as well as my favourite books of the entire year, and you can see which one made it from each of those other videos into the final list. But without further ado, you know what to expect at this point. Let's talk about the best books I read in April, May, June. So the first book I want to talk about is Hunchback, which is a novella by Sao Ichikawa, which has been translated from Japanese into English by Polly Barton. And you don't just have to take my word for how phenomenal this book is. It was also longlisted for the International Man Booker Prize, which is definitely one of my favourite literary prizes to find new books through. I always think it includes a really interesting selection throughout the shortlist and longlisting processes, and I love this. This was definitely worthy of that list. It's about Shaka, who was born with a congenital muscle disorder which caused extreme curvature in her spine, and she uses a wheelchair as well as a ventilator. So this is an everyday part of her life, and she was born into an incredibly wealthy family in Japan. So when her parents passed and they left her all of their money, she started up this assisted facility, this like live-in assisted facility where people with disabilities could live, including herself. Like, she has the sort of penthouse, and then other people live there alongside her. But despite having all of this family wealth, she does make a living. Well, I suppose it's not make a living because she doesn't need the money, but she has this side hustle, shall we say, of writing erotic stories for magazines and online forums, some of which pay her to do this and some of which she presents as reality, like journalism, and some of which she acknowledges are made up, and all of them are made up because she's never experienced any of these things for herself. And for a small book, it manages to pack a lot in there. But for me, like, the standout theme, one that I don't feel is often covered in literature, isn't like one I've read about much, is the way in which someone might explore their own sexuality as somebody who's been desexualized. So she is not really treated like a sexual being. She's never had an opportunity to explore her own sexuality physically, and she is exploring it through these stories in the way that she explores many of the things that she's never been able to experience. And this might seem shocking to some, and the language she uses is intentionally supposed to come across, I think, as shocking to the reader sometimes. But I think what it all serves is essentially one woman claiming her own body and her own sexuality, and it's a really interesting take on that idea. And I found it a very compelling read. It was very quick, very easy to get through, but left me with a lot of food for thought, and I really enjoyed reading from the perspective of this protagonist, so I would highly recommend it. Next up is a non-fiction book I think everyone should read, and that is Pink Pilled by Lois Shearing, which the subtitle of is Women in the Far Right. Okay, I should have been able to remember that. It's pretty straightforward. But this book basically looks at the way in which women are led down far right pipelines. So more and more, and rightly so, we have been talking about the way in which young men in particular are led down these far right pipelines. They are encouraged to hate women, to become like white supremacists, to just like purport incredibly problematic ideas, and how organizations and individuals can reach them in their homes through the internet, but also like in, you know, sort of like public spaces, and how this is all happening offline and online, and that is really important. But as is often the case, we sometimes forget about the experiences of women in this, in the sense that this is also happening to women. So I think like one of the things that this book emphasises really well is that while the far right hate women, it is a movement very much rooted in misogyny, they need women. Women provide a lot of the labour in these movements. They always have done. Women have been a big part of far right and right wing sort of movements historically, and continue to be so. so it is necessary for them to also bring women into the fold, and that is and as some examples, some of the ways this happens online is through like online content that can start off as sort of like cute homesteading and stay-at-home mum content, which then turns into trad wife content, which then just continues to escalate. And it can start in spaces which are in themselves not problematic. It's like paganism or witchcraft. Those things are not inherently problematic, and they can actually be spaces in which left-wing ideas can flourish, but there is also those like right-wing, far-right sides of those, and somebody could just come with an interest in those subjects and sort of be like gradually sort of led down that other sort of avenue, especially if that isn't challenged. And this book basically just explores the way in which this happens to women online and offline, not specifically through that mechanism. I think it's a really important reminder that we can't ignore the fact this is happening. It's only going to get worse if we like sort of look away from it or pretend it's not happening. And for that reason, I would highly encourage everyone to read it. Lois Shearing is an academic. This is published by Manchester University Press, but it's an incredibly accessible book that I don't think you need to have any background in to read and consume and learn something from, so would highly recommend. Another non-fiction book I want to talk about, I did read a lot of really good non-fiction in the past few months, like I've been on a real non-fiction kick, is Mythica by Emily Hauser, the subtitle of which is A New History of Homer's World Through the Women Written Out of It. I actually read an early copy of this book as a proof, and I absolutely loved it. I read a lot about antiquity. I read a lot of journal articles, I read a lot of books, I write about antiquity a lot, and rarely does a book just give me that feeling of first falling in love with a subject again as this did. This is a book which is a split between the mythology of the Homeric epics, so the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the women that feature in those epics and those myths, and a look at the archaeological record for the early civilizations of which these myths supposedly talk, and beyond. It's not a book which proposes that we look at Homer as our source for accurate history, but which centres women in our discussions of both Homer and history, and looks at how those two things can be collaborative, how they can contrast, how they can complement one another. It's hard to entirely summarise, but you'll understand once you read it. It's a book that brings women's lives to life from the past, and it's also incredibly accessible. This is a kind of book where, like, I would recommend this to first year students if I was still teaching at university. I would say to anyone studying ancient Greece or the ancient world or Homer or ancient Greek literature or mythology, I'd be like, go read this book, because this is such a beautiful way to show how myth and history are constantly in play with one another and how both are relevant to one another. And it is so well written, so interesting, really easy to read, but also full of so much interesting information. Like, there was things in here that I didn't know. I also loved Emily's perspective on these stories. She really put a few of them in a new light for me, so that was really wonderful, and I loved it both as a historian and just like as a myth enthusiast who's always just loved these subjects. And I think it would be a great starting place for this subject. I think it would be a great intro to Homer. I don't think you would have to have read the epics before going into this, and I also think it would make a great companion to go alongside them. So yeah, could not recommend that book more highly. So that we're not exclusively talking about non-fiction throughout this video, I actually want to talk a little bit about a series, and it's a manhwa series. So I've recently gotten into manhwa. I think last year was the first time I ever picked up a manhwa, and I'm really enjoying exploring them. I'm really enjoying discovering series that I enjoy and checking out different authors and illustrators, and I'm always looking for more recommendations, so let me know if you have them. But one series in particular that I have enjoyed and which I have gotten past the first 4 volumes of in the past couple of months is Villains Are Destined to Die. And this series fits into the popular genre known as isekai, in which the protagonist is transported from our real world, whether because they've passed away or just who knows why, to the world or a fictional world of a novel or game that they love. And like I said, this is a popular subgenre, and in this case our protagonist Penelope has been transported from our world without context, to the world of her favourite mobile game, which is a game in which you are supposed to like romance different characters. However, the game is easy when you are the heroine, not so easy when you're the villainess, which is what Penelope has become. So Penelope is thrown into what is this sort of like historical inspired magical court system where she is the adopted daughter of a rich duke, but everyone seems to hate her. She has really misbehaved in the past, not without some reason, and now she kind of has to get her reputation back up, and she has to get these people to like her so that they don't kill her. And it is so much fun. It was, I think, no, it's not my first introduction to this genre, but I think it was the first like series that really got me into this genre, that really made me fall in love with this subgenre, because I think it's a really fun idea because it allows you to sort of like mix modern sensibilities and the way we react to characters behaving in books and games in that sort of breaking the fourth wall dynamic with that fun historical fantasy setting. So I think that's a ton of fun, and this series does it really, really well. I'm very much invested. Every time I've gotten to the end of the volume I've been reading, I have needed to know what happens next. Like every single time I've immediately ordered the next volume. I've already ordered the next volume for me to read because I need to know what's going to happen to Penelope next, and it has kept me guessing. Like even 4 volumes in, I'm not convinced I know exactly how she's going to get out of this, how she's going to survive, who she's going to fall in love with. Like it could go in so many directions, and that's a really fun experience as a reader, obviously, to not know where it's going. I also think the illustrations are stunning, which is obviously a big selling point when it comes to any manhwa. It's funny, it's fun, it's adventure filled, and it keeps you guessing, so what's not to love? Alright, so let the non-fiction recommendations continue with another one that I think is a must read. Like everybody should read this right now. Like go buy it. I don't care who you are, what your interests are, you must read this book, borrow it from your library, download the audiobook, whatever you have to do. And that is The New Age of Sexism by Laura Bates. The subtitle of which is How the AI Revolution is Reinventing Misogyny. So as always, Laura Bates writes incredibly accessible books exploring issues of misogyny, feminism, sexism, etc. in the contemporary world, and they're always very like of the now. She's not writing about history, which obviously I think is really important, but she's writing about issues that are not just affecting us now but are going to be affecting us soon, and more so. And this is one of those books where I was shocked by the sort of degree to which certain things had escalated, because I consider myself somebody who's somewhat tech savvy. You know, I have been using computers since I was quite young. Like I love messing around with social media and like playing around with little bits of tech, but I'm by no means an expert. Like there's so much I don't know, and that's even with a husband who works in this industry. And there is apparently so much I don't know about the way in which AI is affecting women and is perpetuating misogyny in our current world, and how bad it is and how bad it's going to get if it is left to just like fester. And I think the first step with anything like this is obviously to bring attention to it, to bring awareness to it. Like again, I feel like I'm semi well versed in this stuff, and I'm also like aware of like current issues facing women. You know, I try to keep up to date with this stuff, but oh my god, the amount of times I was shocked and horrified, appalled and surprised by what Laura Bates brought up in this book. What's going on in these AI brothels and the metaverse, etc. I learned so much, it's almost overwhelming, but I'm really glad my eyes were open to it through this book. And again, not as a tech expert, I was still able to understand it all. Like this book isn't aimed at people who have to have tech knowledge to read it, and Laura Bates does some really in-depth journalism in order to write it. I can't believe what she had to put herself through actually to investigate these issues, and I'm really grateful that she did, because it means I think more of us are talking about it now that this book is out. So I just want to continue that conversation. Would really appreciate if you could go read this book now. That wasn't actually the only book I read on tech recently though, because apparently I have been trying to educate myself on tech and the way it affects our modern lives. So I read a very little book, which is one of the 404 Inklings, and that is Machine Readable Me. I actually read this one with my partner. We read it to each other, which was nice because he was able to kind of like explain some of the nitty gritties of things to me and go a little bit deeper into the tech side of stuff, which I enjoyed. But you don't need to have a Chris to read and enjoy this book. Again, I'll read you the subtitle, which is The Hidden Ways Tech Shapes Our Identity, and this is written by Zara. And I would say that this book is predominantly about the way our data is collected, like our personal data, but particularly like our biometric data and our identity, in order to like categorize us and kind of like create databases. Both the like positive and negative uses of it. This book isn't like anti-tech, it is very much just a book which is about being cautious with this information and this data and how it needs to be regulated, used appropriately, and also not saved and stored. It talks a lot about the way in which refugees and asylum seekers' data has been used and how it is also malfunctioned, and how taking out the human element when using tech can also lead to really problematic outcomes. And I found that really fascinating because, again, it's not something I was aware of, the extent to which this stuff, this kind of like identity data, is being used in these kind of spaces, and how it can be misused. I mean, of course, like anything, it's going to be misused, but again, I think awareness and having these conversations is a big step. It's not the end goal, but it's a big step in improving things. It also emphasises the importance of like self-identification and how we should be allowed to decide what data is collected, how long it's kept for, how it's used, and what it says about us. And it talks about examples of how like bad algorithms and bad data practices have been used to like send innocent kids to prison and perpetuate things like racism and sexism. And it, again, for a very short book, managed to say a lot. It was really interesting. I don't think I can summarise it here because there was a lot covered in it, but I think it was really interesting and pretty accessible for a topic that I'm not an expert in, so I would highly recommend checking it out. I generally just love the 404 Inkling series for being a great way to jump into new topics or topics that you already have an interest in. Like, there's no sort of barrier to reading them. Then another non-fiction book. Yes, I know, I'm sorry, but I've been on a non-fiction kick. All I've wanted to read of late has been apparently manhwa and non-fiction. I've actually just sort of jumped ship to a thriller kick, I have to say, but that's for the next quarter. So back to the non-fiction with Feeding the Monster. Why Horror Has a Hold on Us by Anna Bogatskaya. Now this, I listened to an audiobook. It's read by the writer. Fantastic narration, would highly recommend if you're looking for a new audiobook. And this is such an interesting book. Now obviously I think the primary audience for it is existing horror fans, or people getting into horror, or people who are like long-term fans of the genre, but I actually think it has something to offer for people who aren't into the genre but are maybe just vaguely curious about it. I at least like reading books like that regardless of whether I'm into the genre. I mean, I'm compelled more if I'm into it. I love horror, so that's why I read this book, but I have read books about subjects I have no interest in, but it's interesting to learn why people are interested in it. I think there's value in that, so I'm still recommending it regardless of whether you're into horror or not. But if you're a horror fan, you are going to want to read this book. If anyone has ever asked you, how can you like horror? What worth does horror have? What's wrong with you for liking horror? You need this book. It will give you the language to communicate exactly why that is. Of course, it's different for different people, but I do think horror is such a fascinating genre that whether it be in literature or cinema or other forms of media, it allows us to explore like really nitty-gritty deep parts of ourselves and the sort of human condition and the human psyche. And I've thought this for years, but it's really nice to have that articulated and put down into words by an expert, a journalist in this field who really knows a lot about what she's talking about. Like, she knows so much, she's so well read and seen. She talks about books and films in this, and I definitely got some recommendations from this book. And it's the kind of book where you feel like you're in conversation with the writer. Like, it felt as though I was having a conversation with somebody and I was responding in my head and out loud to the things she was saying about horror, sort of analysing my own takes, whether they fit with hers, and also like expanding my own sort of thoughts on the genre based on what she was telling me. And and as a book, it's very much focused on the here and now in horror. Like, it's not a book about the history of horror. Of course, it touches on older pieces of media, but it's about why now we love horror and the horror that's coming out now and in the past decade, which I think is particularly interesting because most of the non-fiction I've read on horror has been looking at older stuff. It's been looking at, you know, the 20th century and the early horror cinema, or the 90s and the slasher fix. And it's nice to have a book which is very here and now, very contemporary, engaging with the kind of horror that came out like 2 years ago in the cinema and I was watching and maybe maybe like had an impact on my journey as a horror fan. So I really enjoyed this book. Alright, so last but certainly not least in this list of what has predominantly been non-fiction favourites, we have The Walnut Tree. Women, Violence and the Law by Kate Morgan. So this is a history book and it predominantly focuses on Britain. In fact, I think predominantly England from what I recall of the book itself, during the 19th and early 20th century. And it's pretty self-explanatory from the title, isn't it? The subtitle anyway, maybe not the Walnut Tree one, but that is explained. But the subtitle. It's about women and the law, but particularly about the way in which laws regarding women and women's rights changed between the 19th and 20th centuries and the cases that led to those revisions. So we're talking about like how women gain more autonomy in the various legal systems in the UK, because of course like Scottish and English law are not the same, and how, for example, like they gain divorce rights or the ability to divorce under more circumstances, or to prosecute their husbands for violence and abuse, and how those things became taken more seriously, but in that journey also looking at cases where those things were not treated seriously and where women were very much mistreated. And I've read other books about this period. I know a little bit about women's lived experiences and the laws regarding their lives from these periods. I obviously didn't know a lot of other stuff, and I learned a lot from this book, and it was really interesting. It was the perfect kind of history book for me, where it feels like serious and well researched, but also like fun and accessible. As fun as a book on this topic can be, in the sense that it felt like it was written with knowledge and expertise, but for anybody to read, and that is what I desire in my history books. I think that is the best form a history book can take. It should be accessible to all, whilst also possessing kind of like grounding and expertise. So I really enjoyed this, and I definitely plan on reading more by this historian in the future, because she's written a few other books, and I would highly recommend it if you're at all interested in women's history, or particularly 19th century history or legal history. It's fascinating. But those are my favourite books that I read in April, May and June of this year. If you're interested in my favourite books from January, February, March, then I will link that video down below. It had a lot more fiction in it. I don't know if it had any non-fiction in it, in fact, but I can't help it, that's what I've been reading of late, and hopefully you got a recommendation from this video regardless. I love all of these books and would like push them into all of your hands if I could. But in the meantime, I'd love to hear what your favourite books of the first half of the year or the past 3 months were. Let me know in the comments down below, and until next time, happy reading. See you all again soon. Bye everyone.